Chapter 4, Southern Diehards. When civil rights activists arrived in Albany, Georgia in late 1961, Police Chief Laurie Pritchett was ready. Pritchett had read up on the movement's nonviolent strategies. He knew, for example, that the protesters were counting on filling up Albany's jails as a way to stop arrest. So Pritchett called officers at neighboring towns and asked to use their jails. Pritchett told his men that in no way were they to appear rough with protesters. That would only attract negative media attention. The officers were tested July 24, 1962, when angry protesters pelted them with rocks and bottles. The police did not fight back. "Did you see them nonviolent rocks?" Pritchett smugly asked reporters. The classic image of nonviolent protester versus white Southern thug was turned on its head. Earlier that month, the wily Pritchett had arranged to pay Martin Luther King Jr.'s bail when King's jail sentence was starting to receive attention from President Kennedy. In August 1962, King left Albany with segregation intact. Pritchett could not take all the credit, but he was certainly a factor. As he put it, "We met nonviolence with nonviolence, and we are indeed proud of the outcome." Ross Barnett. Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett was at a low point in his career in 1961. A scandal had broken out over gold-plated faucet handles in his mansion and other luxuries he enjoyed. A crowd had even heckled him during a University of Mississippi football game. But 1 year later, Barnett stood triumphantly on the 50-yard line as the crowd wildly cheered him. Like many before him, Barnett had found a cure for his political ills in segregation. In early September 1962, a federal court ordered that African-American James Meredith be enrolled at the University of Mississippi. "Never," Barnett shouted. Barnett personally blocked the door as Meredith tried to enroll at the university on September 25th. The governor was then faced with the threat of arrest unless he allowed Meredith to proceed. As white supporters stood guard at Barnett's mansion, Barnett looked for a way to save face. He telephoned U.S. Attorney General Bobby Kennedy and proposed a deal. Barnett suggested that the federal marshals escorting Meredith draw their guns and pretend to force the state police to give in. Not only did Kennedy refuse, he threatened to leak a transcript of their phone call to the public. A terrified Barnett privately agreed to let Meredith register, but vowed to remain defiant in public. Meredith did register on October 1st, but only after a riot erupted on the campus. For 14 hours, a frenzied mob of 3,000 charged at federal marshals. At the height of riot, Barnett went on the radio. He shouted, "I call on Mississippi to keep the faith and courage. We will never surrender." George Wallace. Alabama's new governor, George Wallace, whipped the crowd into a fervor at his inauguration speech in January 1963. "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever," he declared. The formerly moderate politician vowed to stand in every Alabama schoolhouse door to uphold segregation. Wallace did stand in one schoolhouse door at the University of Alabama on June 11, 1963. His stated goal was to prevent 2 black students from enrolling in truth. In truth, Wallace was looking for a showdown. As TV cameras rolled, Wallace raised his hand, halting the student's white escort in his tracks. Wallace then read a statement blasting the federal government's intrusion. Once President Kennedy took command of Alabama's National Guard, Wallace backed down. With that show of defiance, Wallace's political career took off. He won an unprecedented 3 more terms as Alabama governor and ran for president 4 times. Wallace became confined to a wheelchair in 1972 after an assassination attempt paralyzed him from the waist down. 10 years later, he publicly apologized for his former racist views. He died in 1998. There's Wallace. Chapter 5. Desperate Measures. Almost half of Mississippi citizens were African American in the 1960s. Klan groups and white citizens' councils were also more powerful there. Backed by local government, they kept blacks in their place and out of voting booths. So when Mississippi became the target for a major voting registration drive in 1964, the state's white racists were livid. They especially resented young white Northerners coming in to challenge cherished Southern traditions. When the first Freedom Summer volunteers arrived in late June, Klan members outside the small town of Philadelphia were waiting for them. The hate group had recently burned down a local church for agreeing to host a freedom school. The fire served as both a warning and a lure. Klan leaders knew that volunteers would come to investigate the site. Sure enough, 3 volunteers drove out to the church on June 21st. On their way back, the county's deputy sheriff, Cecil Ray Price, arrested them on fake traffic charges. Price took the 3 to jail, only to release them into the hands of his fellow Klansmen. Klan members gunned the 3 workers down and then buried their bodies under 30 feet, 9 meters of mud. 6 weeks later, federal agents found the bodies. 19 white men were arrested, but the state refused to charge them with murder. Eventually, Price and 6 others were convicted of a lesser charge by the U.S. Justice Department. Still, for the first time ever, the Mississippi jury convicted a Klan member in connection with the death of a black man. Bloody Sunday. Mayor Joseph Smitherman of Selma, Alabama, was getting worried. He had heard that Martin Luther King Jr. was arriving in town to lead a voter registration movement. Smitherman feared his hot-headed sheriff, James Clark, would create a crisis similar to the one in Birmingham in 1963, the 16th Street Church bombing. In September 1963, Klan members in Birmingham, Alabama, were plotting what would become known as the worst crime of the era. Earlier that month, 5 of the city's black children had enrolled at white schools. On Saturday, September 14th, Klansman Robert Chambliss boasted to his niece, "You just wait until after Sunday morning, and they will beg us to let them segregate." The next morning, a bomb ripped through the 16th Street Baptist Church, killing 4 black girls. Within weeks, Chambliss and 3 others were identified as suspects, but the FBI did not have enough evidence to bring them to trial. 14 years after the bombing in 1977, Chambliss was convicted of murder, thanks in part to his niece's testimony. 2 other bombers, Thomas E. Blanton Jr. and Bobby Frank Cherry, were convicted in 2001 and 2002. Smitherman called King and tried to convince him not to come. When that failed, Smitherman leaned on Clark to show restraint, as unlikely as that seemed. Then, in February 1965, Clark punched a civil rights worker so hard the sheriff broke one of his fingers. Smitherman's fear of a crisis became a reality at the Edmund Pettus Bridge on March 7, 1965. Activists had just begun a 54-mile or 87-kilometer march from Selma to Montgomery. George Wallace, Alabama's governor, had banned the march, claiming it would disrupt highway traffic. State troopers slapped billy clubs against their hands as they faced the activists on the bridge. Major John Cloud gave the marchers 2 minutes to retreat, but they refused to budge. What happened next would come to be known as Bloody Sunday. Troopers beat marchers with clubs and cattle prods. Sheriff Clark's men chased protesters on horseback and pushed them off the bridge. That night, ABC TV aired footage from Bloody Sunday. As Smitherman put it, the wrath of the nation came down on us. Governor Wallace still refused to offer police protection for the marchers. He claimed the state could not afford the expense. President Lyndon Johnson took control of Alabama's National Guard on March 21st, and the 5-day march went forward under heavy protection. Major Cloud and Sheriff Clark led the march in a patrol car for part of the way. Clark saved face by telling reporters he was relieved to get the troublemakers out of town. A New South. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 removed barriers to black voters. Soon, about 60% of Selma's African Americans had registered to vote, and Sheriff Clark was ousted. That pattern would continue across the South. Black officials and white moderates took the place of old-school segregationists. As their constituencies changed, some segregationists changed their tunes. They began courting the black vote. Some seemed genuinely sorry for their actions. George Wallace personally apologized to Rosa Parks, John Lewis, and other heroes of the Civil Rights Movement. Segregation had been a political trump card in the Old South. Now it had become a new taboo.